One of the ways I measure my life now, about once a year, I stop and I think about where I'm at. Am I on the right track? Here's the question that I have to answer every year. Is the life I have now worth having killed for it? It's easy to look back and go, that was the wrong choice. People talk about remorse and don't you feel bad about what happened? Yeah, I feel bad about what happened. I didn't have what I saw as a viable choice then. I want people to realize that there is bad all around them. Pay attention to your world. Pay attention to the people around you. Evil lives everywhere. Pay attention. Every parent should be careful because you don't know the lesson you're teaching sometimes. I don't think any child grows up not first feeling that their parents are their gods. I was betrayed by the gods of my childhood. These people were supposed to bring me into the world, protect me, and raise me so that I could function in it.
My favorites. I've caught a lot of fish with this lure.
But there was one time I said something that he took as being a, smart-mouthed answer.
Get me that sleeping bag, all right?
I'll get it when I'm done.
And the backhand came across.
You do what I tell you to do, boy. You got it?
Don't say smart-mouth things. You backtalk, and I will hit you.
When I ask you to do something, you do it. Right away.
He was a very large, powerful person. A backhand from him, that's not a love tap. Not from him. He thought of it as discipline. But at the same time, there were times we'd go out and everything's great, and it never occurs to me that this is anything other than my best friend. When things are good, it's very easy to forget the bad that happened, at least for a little while. My brother was never expected to do anything. My father invested all of his effort in his number one son. I got all of the attention. But every year, the discipline becomes worse, and failure has constantly increasing costs. There was a time when my father wanted me to vacuum up our dining room. And somewhere along the line, I picked up a little screwdriver and I just put it in my pocket. And while I was vacuuming, the thing fell out of my pocket. Well, my dad come in to see how the vacuuming went. And so he's looking over the whole floor and he went absolutely ballistic.
Did you vacuum the whole room?
Yes.
Really?
Because
Well, what's this?
how could I possibly miss this screwdriver sitting in the middle of the floor? if I had actually vacuumed the floor.
What's this? Huh?
Off comes the belt, and he just started hitting.
I told you! Never lie to me! Ever!
Just losing control and continuing to hit.
You just don't learn!
Please stop.
You think I want to do this? This is for your own good! Don't lie to me! Ever!
For my mother, typically, once that started, she would simply walk into another room and wait. It would be absolutely pointless for her to step in between, because the only thing that could happen at that point is her getting hit.
It's for your own good!
But every time that I wound up getting beat down, afterwards, there was my mother making me feel better. And it was my mother who would, put a bandage on it or help with the ice or, if necessary, take me up to the hospital. She was always comforting. Just do what he says. Don't talk back. Encouragement on how to avoid it.
Are you okay? Right? Oh my goodness.
It was always me and my mother. When I was in the 3rd grade, I failed a spelling report. And rather than show my dad this grade, which was kind of what the school required, you have to take the grades and get it signed off and bring it back, I changed the grade or I forged his signature, one of the two. Took him back to school. And shortly thereafter, the principal, of course, dutifully got a hold of my father and let him know what the problem was. He was so mad. Not only did I fail, but worse than anything, I covered it up and lied to him. And that absolutely required punishment. And it just kept going until I couldn't stand there anymore. He used me like a freaking piñata. All you really think about is just, please stop. Eventually, he just got out of breath and his arm got tired. When my mother did get home, she put me in a tub filled with ice and water to try and get the swelling from everywhere down. He has to be stopped. Wouldn't it just be better if he was dead?
Think how happy we would be. It's okay. It's gonna be all right, okay? 'Cause you are strong.
I'm sitting in the tub of ice, and I hurt, and I'm absolutely hating my father. And she's sitting there going, "You've got to do something about this. You can't keep going through this. Wouldn't it be better if he was dead?"
Think how happy we would be.
I was in the 3rd freaking grade. How are you supposed to take that? You're sitting there and anything that's not numb from ice hurts. it's not a big leap to go, yeah, it'd be better if he was dead.
You can do this.
The suggestion in the tub, without a doubt, changed everything for me. Because it took me from just trying to survive what was happening to trying to figure out how I could fix the future.
You'll know what to do.
After the bathtub, we sit down and had a little chat.
Eric, come here. Come.
She asked the question, how can we stop him? And that's what solidifies in my mind that I'm the one that needs to do this. I'm the one that needs to come up with a solution.
Have you thought of anything yet? How to get rid of him?
I don't know.
And so we went through multiple scenarios and options. She would ask, out of all the ways that you could possibly kill him, what do you think is the best way? Okay, what do you need to do that?
Eric, I have a plan that I think is really gonna work.
He took a lot of vitamins. And, well, my mom found these blank capsules that happened to resemble several different kinds he had. So she started packing them with everything from rat poison to Valium. You know, I come in one time and she's just putting them all together and refilling the bottle. After it's done, there was the next few hours of kind of being on edge because is it going to work? Is it not? Is he going to figure it out? He gets up and says, you know, I feel dizzy or I'm feeling sick. Does he know? The reason for helping my mother, I was always taught to believe that you're supposed to protect, defend, support your family against anybody and anything. And if my definition of family seems a little strange because it somehow excluded my father, it excluded him because he became the threat. There were so many times that I walked in and she was spiking something, from mashed potatoes to cans of tuna. Go set this on the table. Here, take this glass out to your dad. Don't take a sip of that. And then we would, sit down at the table, have dinner. But do you use the gravy or what was it spiked with? Yeah, the mashed potatoes might be okay, but what's that white there? She went about trying to poison him for 7, 8 years. To keep doing that day in and day out requires a lot of patience and planning. But I don't think he was ever suspicious about his food was being tampered with. I don't think it crossed his mind that she could possibly get the backbone to try and kill him.
This just isn't working, Eric. It just isn't doing it.
Every poisoning that fails, there was always this push for me doing something directly and extreme.
You have to find something to end this problem permanently.
The poisoning was simply something so that she could say, see, I'm doing what I can. Why haven't you done what you're supposed to?
Step up, Eric.
When are you going to get the nerve to go shoot him? What's the problem?
You have to do this. You have to do this now. No more stalling.
Why don't you hide behind the door so that he doesn't see it coming? The plan was to stay behind where our door opened, and then when he came home, he would go through, and when the door closed, it would give me a clear line of sight at the back of him. Standing behind that door, I was absolutely terrified. He comes home, goes through the door. I couldn't move. This isn't going to work. Standing behind that door, I was absolutely terrified. He comes home, goes through the door. I freeze up. I can't do anything. He was so big and the gun was so small. Pulling the trigger and failing, that was a fear. It's just complete and total paralyzed right there. And he goes in and lays down on the couch to take a nap. And I'm stuck at this doorway and then trying to sneak out of there when I finally hear him snoring. I remember talking to my mom afterwards about that and her asking what happened and me trying to explain I just couldn't do it. Why not? I don't know, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't move. And she basically just talked me through calming down and reassured me that it'd be a better day tomorrow. We'll do this, we'll do it together. The pressure kept growing. If I'm gonna be the man, then I have to step up and protect them. I'm the only one who can do something about it. This eventually reached a point where she winds up telling me that if this doesn't happen, that she's leaving and not coming back until he's dead. She was gonna take her stuff, gone, and we were gonna fend for ourselves with him. On the night he died, it finally comes down to she leaves. And then there was a phone call. I'm gonna be back in about 10 or 15 minutes, and if he's not dead, I'm leaving. I'm done. My father was asleep on a couch, and I was standing just a few feet back from his head. Part of me, I want to just raise the gun and pull the trigger and do this. And another part is I'm just having a real problem finding the ability to pull the trigger. Pulling that trigger is going to change everything. And then I see the light and I know it's her car coming back. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt at that point that if he's not dead by the time she walks through that door, I'm choosing to be with him forever. That's it. I wound up pulling the trigger. After I pulled the trigger, the door opened and my mom took the gun from me.
You did it. Stay there. Give it to me. Give it to me.
She goes over to make sure that he's dead. Picks up the phone and calls the police. She kept talking the whole time she was getting ready for the police to arrive.
Say it.
Have a story and stick to it. I found a gun. I tripped carrying it into him. It went off. We called the police. That was it. And if I do that, then there's nothing that they can put on her. And in a worst case scenario, I will go to juvie and get out when I'm 18. Because they can't hold me as an adult.
Good. Yes.
And I was willing to pay that price for my mother, for my brother, so everything could go on and have a good life.
Good job, big man. You did it.
The detective started questioning me.
Well, okay, look, I know this is tough. Look, was your mom home when you shot your dad?
She was present for whatever got said.
No. She arrived a few moments afterwards.
Okay.
I didn't really get the sense that she was proud because I had killed him. But later on that evening, when the police finally had to say, it looks like this was an accident, then she was proud of me. I had stuck with the plan. How I felt after that was just really numb and indifferent. It's just, whew, that's over. There was no guilt to it. At that point, all I could really see was that what I needed to do had been done. Did I know the difference between right and wrong? Yes. Did I know murder was wrong? Yes. People talk about remorse and don't you feel bad about what happened? Yeah, I feel bad about what happened. I didn't have what I saw as a viable choice then. I miss the good times I had with my dad. I have to get up every day knowing that I took out one of the most important figures in my life. And what I can do is live my life and make it a good one because it cost me a hell of a lot to get it.
So let's talk about...
Can we stop for just a minute?
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
She was always called Grandma. My mother acted like she really liked Elaine. She liked the same brand of cigarettes that Elaine smoked, and they were perfectly happy to sit there and sip on Tom Collins together. There were never any arguments. I remember seeing her adding something to a drink she was mixing. What's going on? Killing him should have been the turning point of we're going to have a bright and happy future after this. The problem is she couldn't settle into just having a nice life. I had come in and startled her, seeing her add something to Elaine's drink.
What are you doing?
Eric.
I don't even remember what reason she gave me why Elaine needed to die.
Listen, Eric. Your father wasn't the only person in this world who deserves a little punishment.
I didn't care what the reason was. There's just no reason that she could give that would make it okay. My father was an obvious, imminent, physical threat. Elaine could never have become a threat. She wouldn't put her own neck on the line for this. If I wasn't there to pull the trigger, nothing else could happen. She'd just be spinning her wheels. Once I came to the conclusion that, well, if I'm not here, nothing can happen, it becomes a simple matter of what is my way out. So I decided to join the Navy. I didn't even make it through boot camp before it all started coming unraveled. I wind up calling home. I said hello, and the next thing I'm hearing is there was an accident.
What?
Your brother and I need your help.
I need to come home.
Now?
Yes, right away. We need you.
Elaine's dead. I tried to get away so that it couldn't happen. And I failed to take into account the fact that she was just going to get my brother to do it. I don't know what exactly my mother had told him, but I'm sure that she probably had conversations with him like she did with me to, scoot him in that direction. Now what do we do? When I get out of boot camp and I finally do get home, me and my mother go downstairs and she shows me the freezer. There's these chains going around and big padlock with a key. And she's got to take all this stuff off to open it up. But she finally gets the thing open and there's a freezer full of garbage bags. 40 bags of grandma. What the What the hell is wrong with you? What?
This mess is your fault, Eric.
She tried to throw back at me that the reason the situation had spiraled into this is because I wasn't there to do it. So my brother had to do it. And what was I going to do about it now?
We're all in this together, Eric. So solve this problem.
The only thing I could think to tell her was try and keep everything calm. Make it look like Elaine is alive and well on a vacation somewhere or something. And don't do anything else to attract attention. I still don't have any idea what to do about the body.
I don't care how you fix it, big man. Just fix it.
All I wanted at that point was to just get away. Pack up the truck, and away I go. Roundabout Tennessee, I'm smelling something bad. There's an ice chest with a rather familiar-looking bag inside of it. I'm carrying a body across the country. She put the chest in there. Not even any warning. It's just, surprise. Yeah, it's not like I can dump this in a garbage somewhere or bury it. The only thing I could think to do was hold on to it so nobody else finds it. So I just keep going to San Diego. So I'm going down the highway, and all of a sudden I see lights come on, and this cop is pulling me over. And he starts going back to, take a look at everything, because that's what troopers do. They're going to look for something unusual. He starts to go on about what's in the chest. And now I have crossed the line. He's either going to kill me or I'm going to kill him. What am I supposed to do? This cop is pulling me over.
What's in the cooler?
Not much.
All right, well, I'm gonna go take a look.
All of this is now blown up and it's about to hit the fan. I am at that point more than willing to get rid of him and stop this from happening. There is no turning back when you're that far in. And a speeder comes by. That just blew the doors off of everything. The trooper abandons the whole investigate what's wrong with me and takes off after the speeder. Great. This is good. I'm just gonna get down the road before that trooper comes back. When I got out to San Diego, I rented a storage unit and put the ice chest in a storage unit. There was this period for a couple of weeks where there actually wasn't any contact with my mother. So I'd kind of thought that things were leveling out, it was getting safe. Then my mother shows up.
We had to come, Eric. You have no idea what's happening at home. They keep asking questions. Where is Elaine? When is she coming back? Your brother is scared out of his mind.
She couldn't keep stalling people, telling them that, Elaine's on vacation.
Everything is completely falling apart.
One of the relatives finally called the police. Well, it just so happens that they wound up getting in touch with the same detective who had investigated my father's death. And nothing ever sat well with him. He started digging into it.
This is on you, Eric. You have to help us. If we go down, you go down.
Okay.
At that point, I was ready to abandon the Navy and run like hell.
Now, Eric, we're leaving now. Go.
Well, that's me. And that's my mother in the background. Right behind me. Whispering in my ear. Don't tell them anything. Don't cooperate. Just stay silent and see how it plays out. So I, of course, didn't cooperate with them. We got split up almost immediately. My brother started talking probably within an hour of being arrested. But I can't really blame him for it. I mean, he was a 15-year-old kid looking at going to prison for more than half of his life. So he said whatever they wanted him to say. And my mother, she had the best attorney she could arrange and was dumping everything on my head. But at that point, it still hadn't occurred to me that maybe I should cut a deal, maybe I should cooperate. When I was a child, I promised that I would see this through. I promised that I would be the one to take the fall. And trying to convince me even 7, 8 years later that I needed to break that promise, that was not an easy thing. And that was probably one of the hardest choices I ever made. I'm never going to say it's my mother's fault that I shot my father. Because in the end, I made a choice. She has to deal with the choices that she made. She's the one that had the grudge. She's the one that wanted them dead. There she is. That would be my mother. I haven't seen a picture of her in 20 years. She looks like she's getting old now. And they're gonna look at those eyes and go, it's just a sad old lady. That is not a sad old lady. That's a scheme waiting to happen. The body may be getting old. The hate goes on. She's not reformed. She's not rehabilitated. She doesn't think of herself as evil. But
the night it happened was supposed to be quiet, the kind of California night that smells faintly of cut grass and asphalt still warm from the sun, the kind of night where nothing headlines the morning paper. But silence can be deceptive. Silence can be staged. Somewhere between the flicker of porch lights and the hum of a distant freeway, a life ended, and no one saw it. No one heard it, or at least no one admitted that they did. By dawn, police radios were crackling with a single phrase that would cling to the town like a curse for decades to come. Missing under suspicious circumstances. By the end of the week, another phrase replaced it: colder, heavier, final. Cold case. California, 1998. The victim was the kind of person journalists later described as ordinary, as if that explained why no one expected violence to find them. Mid-30s. A routine job. A predictable schedule. The kind of neighbor who waved, who remembered names, who lent tools and returned them clean. On the night they disappeared, nothing stood out. No frantic phone calls. No slammed doors. No witnesses running into the street. Just a car left where it shouldn't have been and a house that felt wrong in a way only absence can make a place feel wrong. Police arrived to a scene that offered almost nothing. No blood spatter screaming foul play. No overturned furniture. No forced entry. It was a crime scene disguised as normalcy. Detectives moved through the house slowly, methodically, as if speed might erase what little evidence remained. Drawers were closed. Pictures still hung straight on the walls. The bed was made. Two made. The kind of detail that nags at the back of an investigator's mind, whispering that someone wanted things to look untouched. Outside, neighbors gathered in loose clusters, arms folded, voices low. Shock traveled through the community, not as noise, but as disbelief. This didn't happen here. This didn't happen to people like this. The first hours of the investigation followed the familiar script. Friends were questioned. Co-workers interviewed. Phone records pulled. Credit cards checked. There were no frantic withdrawals, no last-minute purchases, no digital trail leading anywhere useful. It was 1998. Cell phones existed, but they didn't record lives the way they do now. Gaps were easy to hide in. Time swallowed, evidence whole. Every unanswered question stretched wider with each passing hour. Then came the rumors. They always do. A strange car seen late at night. An argument overheard weeks earlier. A shadow moving between houses that may or may not have been real. Police chased them all, knocking on doors, canvassing streets, collecting statements that contradicted each other in small but maddening ways. Everyone remembered something different. Everyone was sure their memory was right. None of it added up to a suspect. Days turned into weeks. The missing person flyers faded under the California sun, corners peeling, faces blurring. The investigation shifted tone, subtly at first, then unmistakably. The word missing gave way to presumed dead. Detectives stopped asking where the victim might be and started asking who had motive. Money? No significant debt. Drugs? No history. Affairs? None that anyone would admit to. It was a crime without a clear reason, and crimes without reasons terrify investigators because they resist logic. The community stayed tense, caught between fear and denial. Parents walked their children to school for longer than usual. Doors were locked earlier at night. Porch lights stayed on until dawn. And yet, life continued because it always does. That, too, was unsettling. Somewhere among them, people whispered, was someone who knew exactly what had happened. Someone who had gone back to work, waved to neighbors, smiled at barbecues. Someone trusted. Police narrowed their focus inward. Statistically, the threat was close. It almost always was. They examined family dynamics, friendships, routines. Who had keys? Who knew schedules? Who knew the house well enough to leave no obvious trace? Interviews were repeated. Alibis scrutinized. Tiny inconsistencies were circled in red pen and revisited until they either cracked or solidified. Most solidified. The case grew heavier, slower, bogged down in unanswered questions and the grinding reality of limited leads. Months later, a discovery shifted the investigation but didn't solve it. Remains were found miles away, in a location both obvious and overlooked, the kind of place you pass every day without really seeing. Time and exposure had erased much of what detectives needed most. Identification took longer than anyone wanted. When it came, it landed with a dull, collective thud. The victim was gone for good. Whatever answers existed were now buried deeper than ever. The crime scene expanded overnight. What had once been a missing person investigation was now a homicide with a body and still no suspect. Forensic teams worked carefully, extracting what little evidence remained. Fibers, trace material, a handful of samples that might one day matter, carefully cataloged and sealed away. In 1998, DNA was powerful but not omnipotent. Technology lagged behind hope. Some samples were too degraded. Others produced profiles that went nowhere. They were stored, logged, and effectively frozen in time. The press descended, then slowly pulled back. Headlines grew less urgent. Cold case replaced breaking news. Detectives rotated off. New cases demanded attention. The file grew thick with paperwork and thin with momentum. Every so often, someone reopened it, chasing a lead that fizzled, re-interviewing a witness whose memory had softened around the edges. Each attempt ended the same way. No arrest, no closure, no answers that could stand up in court. Years passed. The neighborhood changed. New families moved in, unaware of the story embedded in the sidewalks and driveways. Those who remembered spoke about it less often, but never forgot. The victim's name became shorthand for unease, for the idea that safety could be an illusion maintained by routine. Investigators carried the case like a quiet failure, a reminder that not all crimes yield to persistence. And through it all, someone remained invisible. Someone who had blended in so well they escaped suspicion, or at least scrutiny deep enough to matter. Trusted, familiar, close enough to know routines, close enough to know when to act, close enough to vanish back into normal life without raising alarms. That possibility lingered like a shadow at the edge of every theory, unprovable and therefore untouchable. By the early 2000s, the case was officially cold. Evidence boxes sat in storage, labeled in block letters, gathering dust. The community moved on in the way communities do, but anniversaries still brought a tightening in the chest. Detectives who had worked the case retired, carrying questions with them. New investigators read the file and shook their heads at what might have been missed, what technology might one day recover. Because time, while cruel, is also patient. It waits. Advances come quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Databases grow. Techniques sharpen. What once looked like useless fragments become potential answers. Somewhere in storage, sealed and forgotten, the truth waited in microscopic detail, suspended in plastic and paper, biding its time. In 1998, no one could have imagined how the story would eventually twist, how trust would become the most damning evidence of all. Back then, all anyone knew was that a person vanished, a community reeled, and a crime slipped through the cracks of an era not yet equipped to catch it. The silence that followed was not peace. It was pressure building slowly, year after year, until one day it would have no choice but to break. The case didn't go quiet all at once. It faded the way sound does when you walk away from it, each step stealing a little clarity until all that remains is a dull awareness that something is still there, humming beneath everything else. Detectives told themselves they hadn't given up, that the file was still active, technically alive, but the truth sat heavier in the room than any admission. There were no fresh tips, no credible suspects, just a homicide with a body, a timeline full of holes, and a town that had learned how to live with a question mark at its center. Every few months, someone would call it in, a memory sparked by a dream, a name that suddenly felt wrong, a detail that hadn't mattered before. Officers took the calls, wrote the reports, followed the threads as far as they could stretch. Most snapped quickly, some unraveled slowly, wasting weeks before revealing themselves as nothing more than coincidence and fear. The case resisted resolution with stubborn silence, as if it understood the power it still held. The evidence room became the story's unconscious mind. Cardboard boxes stacked on metal shelves, each one labeled, dated, initialed. Inside them, fragments of a night that refused to explain itself. Clothing recovered too late. Fibers with no match. Biological samples collected with care, but limited by the science of the time. They were preserved not because anyone knew what they would prove, but because investigators understood one thing clearly: someday mattered. Back then, DNA was a promise more than a solution. It could exclude, it could narrow, it could suggest. But without a match, without a database large enough to catch a ghost, it remained inert potential. Detectives ran what they could. Profiles came back partial, incomplete, frustratingly close to useful. They were logged, sealed, and returned to storage like unanswered letters. The victim's family lived in a different kind of time. For them, the case never cooled. It burned steadily, fueled by anniversaries and empty chairs at holidays. They learned the language of law enforcement, the difference between leads and tips, between active and open, between hope and procedure. Each phone call from police sent a shock through their lives. Each update, no matter how small, was dissected, replayed, clung to. And each silence that followed felt like another loss. In the neighborhood, the story became cautionary folklore. Parents warned teenagers not to walk alone at night, invoking the victim's name like a protective charm. Longtime residents could point to the exact driveway, the exact corner where things had changed. Newcomers felt it too, even if they couldn't name it. A subtle wariness, a sense that the streets had seen something they refused to forget. Detectives came and went. Fresh eyes brought fresh theories. One investigator became convinced it was a crime of opportunity, a stranger passing through, leaving chaos behind and disappearing forever. Another believed it was personal, intimate, fueled by familiarity and access. Each theory reshaped the same limited facts, bending them toward different conclusions. None held long enough to break the case open. Witnesses aged, memories softened, then hardened around the wrong details. The human mind, desperate for coherence, rewrote events in quieter, simpler ways. What had once been uncertainty turned into confidence built on repetition rather than truth. Investigators learned to navigate these altered recollections carefully, separating emotional certainty from factual reliability. It was painstaking work, often thankless, and rarely productive. The case file thickened, not with answers but with time. Pages yellowed. Handwritten notes gave way to typed reports, then digital summaries. Somewhere in that evolution, nuance was lost. Tone flattened. Urgency dulled. The story became data, and data rarely screams. Then, years later, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those still paying attention. A cold case unit was formed, staffed by investigators who specialized in patience, in revisiting old ground without the arrogance of hindsight. They reopened boxes, reread transcripts, traced timelines again. They asked not just what had been done, but why certain paths had been abandoned. Technology had changed. Databases had expanded. DNA was no longer a promise. It was a weapon. Profiles that once led nowhere could now be run against millions. Familial searches, once unthinkable, were becoming tools of last resort. The past, it seemed, was suddenly vulnerable. But reopening a case also meant reopening wounds. Families were contacted again, voices trembling as they recounted details they had tried to bury. Witnesses were re-interviewed, some cooperative, others defensive, irritated that old suspicions were being stirred. And then there were those who grew nervous, who answered too carefully, who asked too many questions about why the case mattered again after all this time. Patterns emerged slowly, not revelations, but inconsistencies that felt heavier now than they had decades earlier. Timelines that almost fit, alibis that relied too much on memory and not enough on proof. Relationships that had been downplayed, described as casual or insignificant, suddenly looked closer under modern scrutiny. Trust, once assumed, became suspect. One name resurfaced repeatedly, not as a villain, not even as a person of interest, but as a constant. Someone who had been there from the beginning. Someone who knew the victim's habits, their schedule, their blind spots. Someone who had helped search, who had spoken to police willingly, who had been described by others as reliable, kind, harmless. A trusted neighbor. In the early days, that trust had functioned like armor. Investigators had glanced in that direction and moved on, reassured by character references and apparent openness. But time has a way of eroding assumptions. The cold case team looked again, not because they suspected guilt, but because familiarity had become statistically relevant. They compared statements across decades, aligning early interviews with later recollections. Small discrepancies appeared, not dramatic lies, but subtle shifts. Times rounded, locations blurred, certainty increased where it should have faded. Still, suspicion without proof is just noise. The case demanded more than instinct. It demanded something solid, something that could survive the light of a courtroom. That meant evidence. And evidence, after all these years, was a long shot. Boxes were reopened, samples re-examined. Old swabs were sent to modern labs capable of extracting information once thought lost. Weeks passed, then months. Results trickled in slowly, each one a potential dead end. Investigators tempered expectations, reminding themselves that most cold cases stay cold for a reason. But patience is a discipline, and discipline sometimes gets rewarded. The past stirred uneasily. What followed was careful, almost surgical work. No confrontations, no accusations, just quiet collection, legal approvals, background research. The trusted neighbor continued their life, unaware, or pretending to be, that the ground beneath them had begun to shift. Barbecues were attended, smiles exchanged, normalcy performed flawlessly. The community, oblivious, went about its routines, unaware that the case they had learned to live with was breathing again, stretching, testing its limbs. The silence that had settled over the story for years was thinning, not breaking yet, but growing transparent. And somewhere between the old evidence and the new technology, between memory and material fact, the truth edged closer, not rushing, not dramatic, but inevitable. Because cold cases don't stay buried forever. They wait, they watch, and when the moment is right, they surface not with noise, but with precision, ready to turn trust into the most dangerous clue of all. The first real fracture in the case didn't come with flashing lights or an arrest warrant. It came quietly, in a laboratory hundreds of miles away, where a technician stared at a screen a second longer than usual. Numbers aligned in a way they hadn't before. Not a name, not a face, but a direction. A genetic shadow that suggested proximity, bloodline, inheritance. The kind of result that doesn't solve a case, but changes its temperature. Cold, but no longer frozen. Investigators leaned in. This was the danger zone of cold case work, where hope can outrun proof and imagination fills gaps too eagerly. They slowed themselves down, verified, reran, checked chain of custody on evidence collected decades earlier by people who never imagined this moment. The sample had survived. Against odds. Against time. It had waited. The profile wasn't a match to anyone in the system, but it brushed close to something else, relatives. Not immediate, not obvious. A distant echo inside a rapidly expanding database. It suggested a family tree with branches in California, roots stretching back generations. The kind of tree that includes teachers, mechanics, retirees, neighbors. Ordinary people. The worst kind of suspect pool. The cold case unit mapped it carefully, names layered over census records, public documents, old addresses. They weren't hunting a killer yet. They were building context. Who lived near the victim in 1998? Who fit the age range? Who had the opportunity, the access, the silence? Slowly, almost reluctantly, the same name kept reappearing, not as a focal point, but as an anchor. The trusted neighbor again. Always adjacent. Always plausible. Never provable. In the late 90s, that neighbor had been helpful. Cooperative. They had offered information freely, even volunteered theories. Detectives at the time had appreciated it. Helpful people make investigations easier, or at least they seemed to. Looking back, the cold case team noticed how often the neighbor positioned themselves just close enough to be relevant, just far enough to avoid scrutiny. They were present without being central. A perfect place to hide. Re-interviewing them was inevitable. It had to be done carefully. Time changes people, but it also sharpens instincts. The interview took place in a neutral setting, voices calm, questions open-ended. The neighbor appeared relaxed, even amused by the idea that the case was being reopened. They spoke about 1998 with surprising clarity, recounting details others had long forgotten or claimed to have forgotten. That clarity raised eyebrows. Memory rarely stays that sharp without rehearsal. Investigators listened more than they spoke. They noted how the neighbor framed events, where they placed themselves in the timeline. Always reasonable, always helpful. But there were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when answers came too fast, too polished, as if the response had been prepared long ago and simply dusted off. Still, suspicion without evidence is just narrative. The law doesn't move on feelings. It moves on facts, and facts were still elusive. The team expanded outward, quietly collecting reference samples from individuals connected to the genetic line. Consent where possible. Warrants were necessary. Each step required justification, patience, restraint. One mistake could collapse everything. They worked slowly, aware that the person they were circling might sense the shift in gravity around them. Outside the investigation, life went on uninterrupted. The trusted neighbor attended community events, exchanged pleasantries, lived openly. That normalcy was unsettling. It always is. The idea that someone could carry a secret this heavy while performing kindness so convincingly unsettles something deep in the human mind. It challenges the belief that guilt leaves visible marks. Behind the scenes, lab results came back one by one. Some closed doors, others narrowed hallways. The genetic picture sharpened incrementally, like an image coming into focus pixel by pixel. Eventually, the margins tightened enough that investigators faced a moment they had been preparing for, the need for a direct comparison. They couldn't just ask. Not yet. That would spook the process, alert the neighbor that attention had shifted dangerously close. They needed something discarded, something mundane, something invisible. Surveillance was authorized, minimal and precise. Trash pulls, public spaces, coffee cups, the ordinary debris of daily life. When a sample finally arrived at the lab, no one celebrated. This was the point where cases collapse as often as they succeed. Expectations were managed aggressively. Everyone involved understood the stakes, not just for the investigation, but for the story the community had been telling itself for over 2 decades. The wait was excruciating. Days stretched thin. Investigators filled the time rechecking timelines, imagining alternative explanations, preparing themselves for disappointment. Cold cases teach humility. They punish certainty. When the call came, it didn't sound dramatic. It never does. Just a voice on the line, measured, professional, delivering information that altered the trajectory of everything. The DNA was consistent. Not absolute, not yet courtroom ready, but strong enough to collapse plausible deniability. Strong enough to turn a trusted neighbor into a viable suspect. The room went quiet. This was the moment cold case investigators rarely talk about, the emotional whiplash of being right after decades of doubt. Vindication is complicated when it's built on tragedy, but evidence demands corroboration. DNA alone, especially partial or familial, can't carry a case this old without support. Investigators needed motive, opportunity, behavioral consistency. They dug deeper into the neighbor's past, uncovering details that hadn't seemed relevant before. Financial stress in the late 90s, a documented dispute that had been minimized at the time, a pattern of proximity that now felt deliberate rather than coincidental. They re-examined the original night, reconstructing movements minute by minute. Suddenly, gaps aligned. The neighbor's alibi relied on a window of time no one had questioned closely, a drive that took longer than it should have, a stop that couldn't be confirmed. Nothing explosive, just enough to suggest presence where absence had once been assumed. Still, the case hovered on a knife's edge. Defense attorneys thrive on uncertainty, and uncertainty was baked into every cold case. Investigators knew they had to be meticulous. Any overreach would poison the outcome. They prepared for confrontation not as an accusation, but as a test. When they brought the neighbor in again, the tone was different. Polite, firm, grounded in specifics. The neighbor sensed it immediately. The ease was gone. Answers slowed. Clarifications were requested. Small corrections were made. The rhythm of the conversation shifted, and with it, the illusion of control. The neighbor asked what had changed. Investigators didn't answer directly. They didn't need to. Silence did the work for them. Silence, heavy and intentional, the kind that invites confession or exposes fear. Nothing dramatic happened that day. No outburst, no breakdown, just a subtle tightening around the eyes. A defensive posture, the beginning of cracks too small for the untrained eye to notice. Afterward, investigators sat with the weight of what they were building. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about rewriting a community's understanding of itself, about acknowledging that safety had been breached not by an outsider, but by someone welcomed into daily life. The case was no longer dormant. It was awake, restless, pulling evidence toward a center that had been hiding in plain sight all along. And as the pressure mounted, as science closed in on what intuition had whispered for years, one truth became unavoidable. The most dangerous secrets are not kept by strangers in the dark, but by familiar faces in the light. By the time the investigation reached this stage, everyone involved understood that momentum was a fragile thing. Push too hard and it snapped. Move too slowly and it evaporated. The trusted neighbor now existed in a narrow corridor between suspicion and proof, a place where many cold cases have died before. Investigators felt the weight of every decision, aware that one misstep could turn decades of waiting into another false ending. They began reconstructing the neighbor's life around 1998, not as a suspect, but as a pattern. Where they worked, when they left home, who they spoke to, what stresses pressed against them quietly, invisibly. Records that once seemed mundane now felt charged with meaning. Employment files showed a recent demotion that had never been mentioned in early interviews. Financial documents revealed debts that were manageable, but only barely. Phone logs showed frequent contact with the victim in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, more than anyone had recalled. None of it proved violence, but sketched pressure. And pressure is often the missing ingredient in crimes that appear motiveless. The cold case team returned to the physical evidence with fresh eyes, guided by what they now suspected rather than what they once assumed. Fibers recovered from the victim's clothing were compared again, this time against materials common inside the neighbor's home. Carpet types, upholstery blends, everyday objects that rarely raise alarms. One match didn't mean much. Several began to suggest proximity that hadn't been documented before. Still, the investigation moved quietly. No leaks, no press briefings. The last thing they wanted was public pressure contaminating witness recollections or alerting the neighbor to the tightening net. Cold cases are won in silence, not spectacle. Investigators spoke again with people who had known both the victim and the neighbor, this time asking different questions. Not did they get along, but how often did they see each other alone? Not were there arguments, but were there favors? The answers came slowly, reluctantly. People don't like revising their memories, especially when it implicates someone they've trusted for years. One witness paused longer than expected before answering. They mentioned a night, close to the disappearance, when they had seen the neighbor's car parked unusually late near the victim's home. At the time, it hadn't seemed strange. Neighbors visit neighbors. Now it felt heavier. The detail was logged, cross-referenced, placed carefully into the growing structure of the case. Another remembered an offhand comment made months after the crime, something about how the victim wouldn't be bothering anyone anymore. It had been laughed off as dark humor. In hindsight, it felt less like a joke and more like a slip. Investigators knew better than to treat hindsight as evidence. But they also knew patterns reveal themselves only when enough fragments are assembled. The case was no longer a single question. It was a mosaic, and the image was sharpening. The neighbor, for their part, began to sense the shift. People do. Conversations changed tone. Invitations grew fewer. A polite distance emerged in a community that once felt effortless. The neighbor responded by leaning harder into normalcy, attending events, offering help, smiling wider than necessary. It was a performance honed over years, but even the best performances show strain under scrutiny. Behind closed doors, investigators debated timing. When to confront, when to hold back. The DNA evidence, while compelling, still required careful framing. Defense strategies were already being anticipated. Contamination, coincidence, statistical ambiguity. To counter them, the narrative needed reinforcement from behavior, opportunity, and contradiction. They returned again to the night of the disappearance, rebuilding it as precisely as possible. Traffic patterns, store receipts, weather reports, the soundscape of the neighborhood. A barking dog reported in one early statement, but ignored at the time. The direction it faced, the hour it started. Details that once felt trivial now carried weight. The neighbor's timeline narrowed uncomfortably. A gap emerged that could not be explained by work, errands, or witnesses. A small window, too small to notice without intent, large enough to matter. Surveillance continued discreetly, not because investigators believed the neighbor would commit another crime, but because behavior under pressure often reveals truths words conceal. They watched routines, habits, interactions, nothing overt, nothing dramatic, just subtle signs of tension, missed appointments, irritability, a sudden interest in legal topics casually raised in conversation. Then came the search warrant. It was executed carefully, respectfully, with minimal disruption. The goal wasn't spectacle. It was confirmation. The neighbor's home yielded what many cold cases do. Almost nothing obvious. No trophies, no weapons, no hidden rooms of secrets. Just a normal house occupied by a person who had lived there for years. But absence can speak. Investigators noted areas that appeared recently cleaned with unusual thoroughness. Flooring replaced without clear reason. Items discarded that might once have mattered. Again, none of it stood alone. Together, it whispered intent. The breakthrough came not from a dramatic discovery, but from persistence. A forgotten storage space tied to the neighbor's past. A rented unit no longer active, but once logged under their name. Records showed it had been vacated shortly after the victim's disappearance. Access logs were thin, but one detail mattered. The unit had been cleaned professionally before it was returned. Samples taken from residual surfaces yielded trace material consistent with what had been found years earlier on the victim. Not enough to rewrite the case instantly. Enough to close the circle. The walls closed in. When investigators sat across from the neighbor again, the atmosphere was no longer exploratory. It was anchored. Questions were specific. Evidence was introduced methodically, not as accusation, but as inevitability. The neighbor's responses slowed. Denials became narrower. The confidence that had once defined them fractured into irritation, then fatigue. They asked about the storage unit. The neighbor hesitated, claimed they'd forgotten it. Memory failed where it had once been precise. Investigators let the silence stretch. Silence is a mirror. Eventually, people see themselves in it. Still, there was no confession. Not yet. And investigators didn't expect one. Confessions in cold cases are rare, especially from people who have lived successfully with their secret for decades. What mattered now was whether the evidence could carry the story without cooperation. Prosecutors were brought in early, consulted at every step. They challenged assumptions, demanded corroboration, forced the investigation to justify itself relentlessly. This wasn't just about truth. It was about survivability. A case this old would be attacked from every angle. As the legal framework took shape, word began to leak, not to the press, but through the subtle channels of community intuition. People sensed something was happening. Conversations lowered. Speculation returned. The name that had once been spoken with warmth now carried hesitation. For the victim's family, the reopening of the case had become something sharper than hope. It was dread mixed with anticipation. They had waited so long that the idea of resolution felt almost foreign. Closure, they understood, doesn't mean relief. It means finality. And finality is its own kind of loss. Investigators prepared for the next step, knowing there was no turning back. The case had crossed a threshold. What had once been an unsolved mystery, drifting in the past, was now a living accusation anchored in the present. The trusted neighbor, once shielded by familiarity and time, stood exposed to a truth that could no longer be deferred. The evidence was not loud. It was not cinematic. It was steady, cumulative, undeniable in its totality. And as the pressure reached a point where something had to give, one reality settled heavily over everyone involved. The most devastating crimes are not always the most violent, but the ones that hide longest, sustained by trust, protected by normalcy, and revealed only when time itself decides it has waited long enough. By now, the case had crossed into a phase investigators rarely experience, but never forget, the moment when probability hardens into direction. There is no single piece of evidence that screamed guilt, no cinematic reveal that justified decades of silence all at once. Instead, there was weight, accumulated, compounding, the kind of weight that bends every new fact toward the same conclusion until resisting it becomes intellectually dishonest. The trusted neighbor felt it too. People always do. Pressure changes the way time moves. Days stretch, nights compress. Sleep becomes shallow, crowded with rehearsed explanations and imagined confrontations. For years, they had lived inside a narrative that protected them, one built on cooperation, on the appearance of reliability, on the assumption that monsters look different. That narrative was eroding now, grain by grain. Investigators adjusted their strategy accordingly. This was no longer about discovery. It was about containment, ensuring that evidence remained uncontaminated, that witnesses were insulated from suggestion, that every procedural step could survive being dismantled in open court by someone whose sole job would be to create doubt. Cold cases don't collapse because investigators are wrong. They collapse because they move too fast when they're finally right. The DNA evidence, while compelling, remained the most delicate element. Defense teams love statistics. They thrive in margins of error. Prosecutors needed context, behavioral, temporal, circumstantial context, to anchor the science to a story that made sense to 12 people who would eventually sit in judgment. And that meant revisiting motive again, not as speculation, but as narrative logic. The victim and the neighbor had shared more than geography. That much was now undeniable. They had shared routines, trust, and a quiet dependency that few had noticed at the time. Favors exchanged, errands run, small boundaries crossed and normalized. It was the kind of relationship that never registers as dangerous until something goes wrong, until someone feels entitled. Investigators uncovered a series of interactions that, taken alone, meant nothing. Taken together, they suggested escalation, a request the victim had refused, a disagreement minimized as trivial, a sudden cooling in tone in the final days before the disappearance. None of it rose to the level of a documented conflict, but it sketched friction, and friction generates heat. The timeline of the night itself was refined again, compressed tighter, narrowed further. Every minute accounted for except one short span that sat like a bruise on the reconstruction. The neighbor's phone activity dipped during that window. Not unusual, but paired with the absence of corroboration, it became significant. The car's mileage, logged days later during a routine service, showed a discrepancy that aligned too neatly with the distance to where the remains had been found. Still circumstantial, still defensible, still dangerous to underestimate. The cold case unit consulted behavioral analysts, not to label the neighbor a killer, but to understand longevity, how someone carries a secret like this for decades without fracture. The answer was uncomfortable in its simplicity. Routine, compartmentalization, a sense of having gotten away with it that solidifies into entitlement rather than guilt. Over time, the act stops feeling like a crime and starts feeling like a solved problem. That insight reshaped how investigators approached the next interview. They no longer expected fear or remorse. They expected irritation, fatigue, a sense of injustice at being questioned after so long. And they were right. When a neighbor sat down again, the politeness was intact but brittle. They asked how long this was going to take, asked whether there was anything concrete, or if this was just another review. Investigators responded with calm precision, laying out facts without interpretation. The storage unit, the fibers, the timeline gap, the DNA consistency. The neighbor didn't explode. They deflected, questioned relevance, suggested coincidence. Their tone sharpened, then retreated into forced composure. They had rehearsed denial for years. But rehearsal doesn't prepare you for accumulation. At one point, an investigator asked a question they hadn't asked before. Not about the crime, but about trust. About how the community had relied on them after the disappearance. About how they had helped search, comforted others, spoken at vigils. The neighbors stiffened. Something passed over their face, too fast to name. Pride or resentment. The interview ended without an arrest. That was deliberate. Arrests are not pressure points. Time is. As weeks passed, the investigation tightened further. Prosecutors began drafting charges in parallel, testing the case against worst-case scenarios. What if the DNA was challenged? What if key witnesses recanted or died before trial? What if the narrative felt too neat, too retrospective? Every weakness was interrogated before a defense attorney ever could. Meanwhile, the community's unease grew perceptible. Rumors circled. Names were whispered, then abruptly silenced. People revisited memories they hadn't thought about in years, wondering what they'd missed, who they trusted too easily. The idea that the answer had been living among them all along was more disturbing than the crime itself. It suggested complicity through inattention. The victim's family was brought into the loop carefully. No promises, no declarations, just honesty. The case was strong, they were told, but strength is not certainty. They listened, nodded, absorbed it with the weary composure of people who had learned not to celebrate early. Hope had hurt them before. Behind closed doors, investigators confronted a final question: timing. Arresting too early wrist collapse. Waiting too long wrist loss. Of evidence. Of witnesses of control. The balance was razor thin. The decision came after one final forensic result returned, quietly, without fanfare. A corroborative match. Not definitive on its own, but reinforcing the existing structure in a way that made retreat illogical. The kind of result that doesn't make headlines, but makes cases. The warrant was prepared. On the morning it was served, there were no sirens. No dramatic entry. Just officers at a door that had opened freely to neighbors for years. The trusted neighbor answered, surprised but composed. They listened as the charges were read. Their face did not register shock so much as recognition, as if this moment had been anticipated, delayed, but never truly avoided. Handcuffs closed with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. News broke quickly. It always does. The phrase "cold case solved" flooded screens and headlines, paired with a name no one had expected to see there. The community reeled. Interviews replayed. Old footage resurfaced. People searched their memories for warning signs that might absolve them of disbelief. But absolution is rare in moments like this. What remains instead is reckoning. For investigators, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. Solving a case this old doesn't feel like victory. It feels like gravity finally doing its work. A body in motion, slowed by friction, eventually stopping where it should have stopped all along. For the neighbor, the performance was over. Normalcy, that most effective disguise, had failed at last. And for the case itself, after decades of silence and speculation, the truth had emerged not as a revelation, but as an accumulation, proof that even the longest shadows eventually give way when light is applied patiently enough. The arrest did not end the story. It fractured it. Truth, once pulled into the open, rarely arrives cleanly. It arrives contested, examined, resisted. In the hours after the trusted neighbor was taken into custody, the case transformed from investigation to battlefield. The quiet patience that had defined the cold case phase gave way to something sharper, louder, more adversarial. This was no longer about discovering what happened. It was about proving it beyond doubt. The accused said nothing publicly. No statement, no outburst, no plea for understanding. Their attorney spoke instead, measured and immediate, calling the arrest premature, the evidence circumstantial, the DNA statistically interesting but legally fragile. The language was deliberate. Words chosen not to persuade the public, but to seed doubt early, to frame the narrative before it could harden against them. Investigators expected it. They had built the case knowing this moment would come, knowing every decision would now be scrutinized not by colleagues, but by people paid to dismantle their work piece by piece. Chain of custody, lab protocols, interview techniques from 25 years ago. Everything was fair game. The past was about to be put on trial alongside the defendant. For the victim's family, the arrest triggered a wave they had never fully prepared for. Relief collided with grief. Validation tangled with anger. They had waited decades for this name to be spoken in this context, and now that it was, it didn't bring peace. It brought noise, cameras, questions, a spotlight they had never asked for and could not avoid. Court proceedings began with procedural gravity, bail hearings, motions, arguments about admissibility that unfolded in language precise enough to feel alien. The DNA evidence, the very thing that had resurrected the case, became the first major point of contention. Defense experts questioned degradation, contamination, interpretation. They spoke calmly, confidently, turning scientific nuance into reasonable doubt. Prosecutors responded by widening the frame. This case, they argued, was not built on DNA alone. It was built on convergence, on timelines that aligned, on fibers that traveled where they shouldn't have, on behavior that grew more suspicious the longer it was examined, on a pattern of access and opportunity that no longer felt coincidental when placed under modern scrutiny. Witnesses were prepared carefully. Some are older now, voices slower, memories fragile. The prosecution coached them not on what to say, but on how to say what they remembered without embellishment. The defense, inevitably, would exploit any uncertainty. In cold cases, time is both ally and enemy. The community watched from a distance, absorbing the details with a mix of fascination and discomfort. This wasn't a stranger dragged in from elsewhere. This was someone they had known, someone they had trusted with house keys, with pets, with children. The trial forced a collective reckoning. How well do we really know the people around us? As pretrial hearings unfolded, the accused maintained composure. No visible remorse, no visible fear, just a quiet, controlled presence that unsettled observers more than anger would have. Psychologists would later describe it as compartmentalization perfected over years. A person who had lived so long with their version of events that the legal challenge to it felt abstract, almost offensive. Prosecutors introduced the storage unit evidence next, not as a smoking gun, but as connective tissue. The timing of its use, the professional cleaning, the trace material that echoed what had been found years earlier. Defense attorneys countered with alternative explanations, painting the unit as a forgotten detail inflated by hindsight. The courtroom listened, took notes, waited. The most delicate testimony came from investigators themselves, men and women who had inherited the case long after the original crime, who had to explain not just what they found, but why it had taken so long to find it. They spoke of technological limits, of databases that didn't exist in 1998, of evidence preserved not because it was useful then, but because someone had believed it might be useful someday. That someday had arrived. The trial's emotional center was not forensic. It was temporal. The prosecution emphasized patience. The idea that justice delayed, Is not justice denied when delay is imposed by reality rather than neglect? The defense emphasized decay, memories fading, evidence aging, the inherent unfairness, they argued, of trying someone for an act committed in another era. Jurors sat between these narratives, absorbing not just facts, but tone, the rhythm of testimony, the confidence of experts, the subtle cues that shape belief. Cold case trials are as much about persuasion as proof. They demand that jurors imagine the past clearly enough to judge it fairly, without the benefit of immediacy. As weeks passed, tension mounted. The accused family avoided the press, shielding themselves from the fallout of association. Friends quietly distanced themselves, unsure how to reconcile their memories with the accusations unfolding in open court. The idea that someone could perform decency so convincingly for so long gnawed at people. It suggested vulnerability not just to crime, but to deception. Closing arguments approached like weather. Predictable, inevitable, heavy. Prosecutors spoke of accumulation again, of how no single strand could bear the weight of the truth alone, but together formed something unbreakable. They reminded jurors that certainty is not the absence of doubt, but the resolution of it. The defense countered with restraint. They did not need to prove innocence, only doubt. They asked jurors to consider alternatives, to respect the burden of proof, to resist the emotional pull of a long unsolved tragedy finally finding a face. When deliberations began, the courtroom emptied into waiting. Days passed without word. Speculation filled the silence. Commentators dissected testimony. Armchair analysts replayed moments, searching for tells, for signs of inevitability. But verdicts are born in private, shaped by conversations no one else hears. When the jury returned, the room felt smaller. Breath was held collectively. The verdict was read, each word landing with weight earned over decades. Guilty. The sound that followed was not applause. It was release. Quiet. Shuddering. In the gallery, the victim's family closed their eyes, not in celebration, but in exhaustion. The fight they had been forced into had finally ended. What remained was grief, reshaped but undiminished. Sentencing came later, formal and final. The judge spoke of betrayal of trust, of harm compounded by time, of a life taken and a community misled. The accused listened, expression unreadable. Whatever version of the story they had lived with for years had now been overwritten by record and law. Outside the courthouse, microphones waited. Statements were made. Headlines were written. Cold case solved appeared everywhere, bold and declarative. But inside those words lived complexity no headline could contain. Because solving a cold case does not rewind time. It does not restore what was lost. It does not erase years of uncertainty. What it does is something quieter, more fragile. It replaces a question with an answer. It names the shadow that has lingered too long. And for the community, for the investigators, for the family who had waited through seasons and decades, that answer, however painful, was finally enough to let the silence change shape, from accusation to memory, from mystery to mourning, from waiting to something like rest. After the verdict, the town did not exhale the way people expected it to. There was no collective release, no sudden lightness. Instead, the air felt heavier, as if certainty itself carried weight. For years, the case had lived as a question, and questions, strange as it sounds, can be easier to live with than answers. Questions don't force you to choose sides. Unveils do. The name of the trusted neighbor now sat permanently beside the word guilty, and the community struggled to reconcile that pairing. People replayed conversations in their minds, searching for missed signals. Smiles remembered too clearly. Gestures once read as kindness now recast as camouflage. The past became unstable, reshaped by the present in ways that left many feeling complicit simply for having believed. Investigators felt a different kind of aftermath. The adrenaline that had carried them through arrests and trial prep drained away, leaving behind a dull ache of retrospection. They asked themselves whether the case could have been solved sooner, whether something obvious had been overlooked because it was too familiar to question. Cold case victories are never clean. They arrive tangled in what-ifs. The victim's family entered a phase no one prepares you for. Justice, when it finally comes, doesn't arrive with instructions. There were no more court dates to anticipate, no phone calls from detectives promising updates. The machinery that had occupied so much emotional space for decades simply stopped. In the silence that followed, grief resurfaced in unfamiliar forms. This time, it wasn't sharpened by uncertainty, but by finality. Media coverage surged, then fragmented. National outlets summarized the case in clean arcs: disappearance, decades of mystery, DNA breakthrough, trusted neighbor exposed. It was compelling. It was accurate. And it was incomplete. What headlines couldn't capture was the slow erosion of trust that followed. The way people began locking doors in daylight. The way conversations grew guarded when they drifted too close to the topic. Schools discussed the case carefully, emphasizing safety without spreading fear. Churches held quiet services that felt less like prayer and more like collective processing. Therapists reported an uptick in patients wrestling with anxiety rooted not in the crime itself, but in its implications. If this could happen here, with someone like that, then what did safe really mean? The convicted neighbor was transferred to a long-term facility, stripped of the ordinary freedoms that had once shielded them. Their life collapsed into routine, regulated and observed. In interviews years later, correctional staff would describe them as compliant, reserved, unremarkable. Even now, there was no performance of remorse, just endurance. Some secrets, it seemed, remained private even at the end. Appeals were filed as expected, arguments refined, evidence re-examined yet again. But the core of the case held. The accumulation remained intact. Each challenge failed, not because it lacked intelligence, but because it lacked an alternative explanation strong enough to displace the truth already established. The conviction stood. 4 cold case investigators elsewhere, the case became a reference point. Training seminars dissected it. Articles highlighted the importance of evidence preservation, of resisting assumptions, of revisiting familiar figures with fresh skepticism. The phrase trusted neighbor entered professional vocabulary not as cliché, but as caution. Technology continued to advance, and with it, the quiet promise that other frozen cases might thaw. Families reached out to detectives, hopeful, desperate, asking if their loved one's case might be next. Investigators answered honestly. Not all evidence survives. Not all stories leave enough behind to be told fully. The solved cases make headlines. The unsolved ones remain. In the town, the physical landscape barely changed, but the emotional geography shifted permanently. Certain houses carried stories now. Certain streets felt different at night. People learned to live with that, the way humans always do, but the knowledge never fully faded. It settled into local history, passed along in cautious tones to newcomers who asked why some places felt so quiet. The victim's name, once synonymous with mystery, took on a different gravity. Memorials changed language, no longer remembering the unknown, but remembering the truth. It mattered. Naming the harm didn't heal it, but it honored it in a way silence never could. Years later, when interviews revisited the case, detectives spoke less about technique and more about patience, about resisting the urge to force conclusions, about letting evidence speak when it's ready, even if that readiness takes decades. They acknowledged mistakes, not with defensiveness, but with humility. Cold cases teach that certainty is often the enemy of progress. The most unsettling legacy of the case wasn't the crime itself. It was the realization that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it borrows the language of decency, the habits of helpfulness, the mask of reliability. Sometimes it waits quietly, counting on time to protect it. In quiet moments, people still ask the unanswerable questions. What if someone had pushed harder in 1998? What if a detail hadn't been dismissed? What if technology had arrived sooner? These questions lingered not because they changed anything, but but because they reminded everyone how fragile truth can be when it depends on context and courage. And yet, there was something else too, something steadier. Proof that patience mattered. That evidence, preserved by people who refused to throw it away, could one day speak. That silence doesn't always mean defeat. Sometimes it means waiting for the right moment to be broken. The case entered archives not as an open wound, but as a scar, visible, permanent, instructive. It stood as a reminder that justice is not always timely, but it can be persistent. That trust must be earned continuously, not assumed indefinitely. That communities are strongest not when they deny their darkest moments, but when they confront them honestly. Long after the cameras left and the reporters moved on, the story continued to echo in small, personal ways, in how people checked in on each other, in how they paid attention to details they once ignored, in how they understood that safety is not the absence of threat, but the presence of awareness. The night the crime occurred remained unchanged in memory, quiet, ordinary, deceptive. But the silence it created had transformed. It was no longer the silence of ignorance. It was the silence that follows truth, a silence that holds sorrow, accountability, and the uneasy knowledge that some answers arrive only after a lifetime of waiting. And so the case rested, finally named, fully exposed, no longer drifting in the cold. Not because time had been kind, but because time, relentless and impartial, had done what it always does in the end. It had removed the places where secrets hide, leaving behind a truth that could no longer be outrun, only remembered. Time had not stopped when the case closed. It never does. It moved forward with quiet insistence, carrying the consequences of the truth into places no verdict could fully reach. The files were archived, the evidence sealed for the last time, but the story refused to become past tense. It lingered in conversations that began with unrelated topics and ended, inevitably, with the same name spoken more softly than others. Solved did not mean finished. It meant altered. For the investigators who had lived inside the case for years, there was an unexpected emptiness. The daily discipline of focus had vanished, leaving behind a vacuum where urgency once lived. They returned to other files, other families, other waiting questions, but this case followed them in subtle ways. In how long they lingered on familiar faces, and how often they challenged assumptions they might once have accepted. The trusted neighbor had become a lesson written too deeply to ignore. New cold cases arrived, each carrying its own gravity, its own ache. Families asked the same question again and again. Could this one be solved too? Investigators answered carefully. They spoke of evidence, of preservation, of the role of chance. They did not promise miracles, but they spoke with a confidence shaped by experience, by the knowledge that time, when paired with patience, can sometimes be persuaded to give something back. The victim's family navigated a quieter, lonelier phase of grief. The trial had given them structure, purpose, a sense of movement. Its end left them alone with memories sharpened by confirmation. They knew now what had happened, or close enough to it to stop imagining alternatives. That knowledge was not peace, but it was solid. It allowed grief to settle into a shape that could be carried rather than constantly reassembled. They revisited places they had avoided for years. The street where the house once stood. The park where memorials had been held. These places felt different now, not less painful, but less accusatory. The unanswered question that had haunted them no longer followed their steps. In its place was something heavier but steadier, truth. The convicted neighbor's absence reshaped the social fabric in quiet ways. Some friendships ended without conversation, dissolving under the weight of proximity to the truth. Others deepened, bound by shared disbelief and mutual support. People spoke more openly about fear, about intuition, about the subtle warnings they wished they had understood earlier. It wasn't paranoia. It was awareness hard-earned. Years passed, and the case entered academic discussions, forensic conferences, training manuals. Analysts spoke about the DNA breakthrough, about familial searches and the ethics they raised. Others focused on behavioral blind spots, on how trust can function as camouflage. The case became an example, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. That was the most unsettling part. Students studying criminal justice read about it as history, unaware that for many, it was still lived experience. They learned timelines and evidence lists, but struggled to grasp the emotional endurance required to wait decades for resolution. Professors tried to explain it, emphasizing patience, humility, and the courage to revisit what seemed settled. Occasionally, letters arrived at the prosecutor's office or the police department. Strangers writing to say the case had changed how they saw their own communities, how they questioned assumptions, how they paid attention. Some letters were grateful, others angry, accusing the system of waiting too long, of failing the victim when it mattered most. Both reactions were valid. The truth rarely satisfies everyone. The story continued to evolve online, shaped by documentaries, podcasts, long-form articles that revisited the narrative with dramatic flair. Some emphasized the shock. Others leaned into the forensic triumph. Few captured the slow, grinding uncertainty that had defined most of the case's life. That uncertainty, unmarketable and uncomfortable, was the truest part of it. In interviews years later, investigators were asked the same question repeatedly. How did the neighbor get away with it for so long? The answer was never simple. It involved technology, yes, and timing, and chance, but mostly it involved belief. The belief that familiarity equals safety. The belief that cooperation equals innocence. The belief that evil announces itself clearly enough to be recognized on sight. The case dismantled those beliefs one by one. In the community, younger generations grew up knowing the story as something half legend, half warning. Parents told it carefully, avoiding graphic details, focusing instead on awareness and communication. The name of the victim was spoken with respect, not fear. Their life reclaimed from the shadow of their death. Memorials became quieter, more personal, less about demanding answers, more about honoring memory. The family attended when they could, stepping away when it became too much. They had learned that healing is not linear. It advances, retreats, pauses. It does not end. From time to time, the convicted neighbor's name resurfaced in legal filings, appeals denied, motions dismissed. Each one reopened the wound briefly, then allowed it to close again. The legal system moved forward, methodical and indifferent to emotion. Its role was finished. What lingered instead was a collective awareness of fragility, of how easily routine can mask danger, of how long silence can stretch before it finally breaks. The case had taught the town something it could never unlearn. Safety is not guaranteed by familiarity, and truth is not obligated to be timely. And yet, there was resilience in that knowledge, a sharpened sense of responsibility. People checked in more, asked questions sooner, trusted but verified. The crime had taken something irretrievable, but it had also left behind a caution that might one day prevent another loss. Late at night, when streets fell quiet and porch lights hummed softly, the memory of the crime still surfaced. Not as fear, but as reminder. A reminder that silence can hide many things, but not forever. That evidence, no matter how small, carries the potential to outlive lies. That time, often accused of erasing truth, can also preserve it. The case no longer belonged to headlines or courtrooms. It belonged to the spaces between people, in the way trust was given more deliberately, in the way kindness was still offered but not blindly, in the understanding that normalcy is not proof of innocence, only a surface. Solved. The word remained accurate, but it never felt complete, because some stories don't end when the truth is revealed. They continue, reshaped by what that truth demands of those who live with it. The California night where it all began remained quiet in memory, deceptively so. But the silence it carried had changed. It no longer concealed. It remembered, and in that remembering, it ensured that what had been hidden for so long would not disappear again. Not into rumor, not into myth, not into cold. It stayed where it belonged, in the open. Years after the conviction, When the case had settled into records and memory, something unexpected happened. The story refused to fade. It didn't resurface as scandal or controversy, but as reflection. People returned to it not to argue the verdict, but to understand themselves in its shadow. The crime had been solved, yet its deeper implications continued to ripple outward, touching lives that had never known the victim or the accused personally. In the town, anniversaries passed quietly. No news vans, no speeches, just a subtle pause in the collective rhythm. Some residents marked the date privately, standing a little longer at windows at night, listening to the familiar hum of a place that had once felt invulnerable. Others avoided the memory altogether, convinced that dwelling on it invited fear back into a life that had fought hard to reclaim balance. Former jurors carried the case in a way no one else could. They had seen everything laid bare: evidence, arguments, doubt, certainty, and had been asked to decide where truth lived. In rare conversations years later, they described the weight of that responsibility, how the image of the trusted neighbor sitting calmly at the defense table still surfaced in their thoughts. They spoke not of guilt, but of fragility, of how close certainty always is to assumption. For investigators, the case became a measuring stick, not of success, but of restraint. Younger detectives heard it referenced when mentors spoke about patience, about resisting the urge to resolve discomfort too quickly. The lesson was not that anyone had failed in 1998, but that the limits of an era must be acknowledged honestly. Technology defines possibility. Time defines perspective. Cold case units across the country cited the investigation when arguing for funding, for preservation, for the unglamorous discipline of storing evidence that may never matter, until suddenly it does. In conference rooms and training sessions, the phrase decades later took on new urgency. It was no longer abstract. It was proven. The victim's family lived with a complicated legacy. Their loved one's name had become known far beyond the circle that had once defined their life. Strangers recognized it, associated it with resilience, with patience, with a story that ended differently than most. Gratitude from others sometimes felt heavy, almost misplaced. They hadn't chosen to be symbols. They had chosen to endure. They spoke occasionally at events focused on victims' rights and cold case advocacy, careful not to romanticize the journey. They described the waiting as the hardest part, not the not knowing, but the endless recalibration of hope. Hope raised, hope deferred, hope learned to be quiet. Their message was simple and unsatisfying. Justice can come, but it doesn't heal everything it touches. The convicted neighbor aged behind walls that did not forget. Time passed differently there, marked by routine and regulation. Appeals dwindled. Legal options narrowed. The story they had lived with privately for decades was now fixed in public record, unchangeable. Some who studied the case wondered whether remorse ever surfaced, whether regret ever intruded. There were no clear answers. Some truths die with the people who keep them. The house where the neighbor had lived changed hands more than once. New paint, new landscaping, new families. Most learn the history eventually, as people always do. Some move away. Others stayed, choosing not to let the past dictate the present. The physical world absorbed the story without comment, indifferent to the meaning layered onto it by human memory. The street where the victim once lived also evolved. The original house was remodeled, then replaced. Children played where investigators once stood. Life asserted itself stubbornly, as if determined to prove that trauma does not own geography forever. And yet, for those who knew, the space retained a quiet gravity. Not fear, recognition. In digital spaces, the case continued to circulate, reframed by new voices. Amateur sleuths dissected timelines. Comment sections filled with certainty unburdened by responsibility. Some insisted the truth was obvious all along. Others questioned the verdict, suspicious of anything that arrives late. The internet flattened nuance, as it always does. But beneath the noise, the core facts held. Documentaries revisited the evidence with dramatic pacing, ominous music, selective emphasis. They were compelling. They were incomplete. They could never replicate the years of silence, the ordinary days when nothing happened and hope learned to wait. Viewers felt shock. Investigators remembered monotony. Both were part of the same story. What endured most strongly was not the crime itself, but the shift in perception it created. People learned that danger is not always external, not always announced by difference. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in familiarity, insulated by routine. The case didn't teach distrust. It taught attention. In schools, teachers used it cautiously, framing discussions around critical thinking rather than fear. Students were encouraged to question narratives, to understand how assumptions form and harden. The case became a lesson not just in criminal justice, but in psychology, sociology, and ethics. It demonstrated how communities protect themselves not only from harm, but from uncomfortable truths. Late at night, when investigators were asked in interviews what stayed with them most, they rarely mentioned the arrest or the verdict. They spoke instead about the evidence technician who had sealed a sample in 1998 without knowing why, about the detective who logged a detail that seemed irrelevant at the time, about the discipline of not discarding what you don't yet understand. Those small acts of faith, uncelebrated and unseen, had carried the truth across decades. The phrase cold case solved remained accurate but inadequate. It suggested an ending where there was really a transition. The mystery had closed, but the reckoning continued. The story no longer asked who did it. It asked how it was possible and what that possibility demanded from everyone else. In the end, the case did what few do. It changed behavior. Not dramatically, not universally, but enough to matter. People listened differently, questioned gently, paid attention to patterns rather than impressions. The town did not become fearful. It became observant. The California night that began the story remained deceptively ordinary in memory, still warm, still quiet. But it no longer represented ignorance. It represented a moment before knowing, a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. The case had waited patiently for truth to catch up with it. And when it finally did, it did not roar. It settled. It integrated. It became part of the landscape of understanding, a reminder that time does not erase everything. Some things it preserves, carefully, until the world is ready to see them clearly. And so the story lived on, not as a warning shouted loudly, but as a presence felt quietly. A reminder that answers can arrive long after the questions stop being asked, and that when they do, they change more than the past. They change how the future is watched. By the time the case reached its 10th year after resolution, it had slipped into a strange category of history, too recent to be forgotten, too old to feel urgent. It existed in the background, like a scar beneath clothing, no longer visible but never gone. People spoke about it less often, yet when they did, their voices still lowered instinctively, as if the story itself demanded restraint. What lingered was not the brutality of the crime, but the deception that had surrounded it for so long. The idea that the truth had lived just down the street, behind a familiar smile, unsettled something fundamental. It forced a reevaluation of how, well, anyone ever truly knows the lives intersecting with their own. Trust, once broken at that scale, does not shatter loudly. It erodes quietly, grain by grain. Law enforcement agencies continued to study the case in workshops and closed-door briefings. Not as a triumph, but as a cautionary tale about time. They spoke about the patience required to let evidence speak when witnesses fade, about the humility of admitting that certainty is often provisional. The DNA match had been definitive, but everything leading up to it had been human. Assumptions, blind spots, cultural norms that shaped how suspicion was distributed. Detectives who had retired before the arrest watched from the outside as the story reached its conclusion. Some felt relief. Others felt something closer to grief. They had spent years carrying unanswered questions, only to learn that the answers had been present all along, waiting for the tools to decode them. In private moments, a few wondered how different their careers might have felt if the truth had arrived sooner. Then they reminded themselves that regret changes nothing. The evidence room where the crucial sample had been stored became almost symbolic. Shelves of sealed boxes, each one containing a fragment of a life interrupted. It stood as a testament to the discipline of preservation, to the unglamorous labor of cataloging and waiting. Younger officers walked those aisles with a renewed sense of responsibility, aware that what seemed insignificant today could redefine a life tomorrow. The case also reshaped conversations about memory. Witnesses who had testified decades earlier struggled with the realization that their recollections, once given with confidence, had been incomplete or mistaken. They were not blamed. They were human. Time alters perception, softens edges, rearranges details. The story became an example of why memory must be treated carefully in the pursuit of justice, respected but never worshipped. For the community, the solved cold case became part of its identity, though not one it advertised. New residents learned about it through hushed anecdotes, usually prefaced with a pause, as if the speaker were deciding whether the knowledge should be passed on. Some believed in transparency. Others preferred silence. Both reactions were rooted in the same impulse: protection. The victim's name continued to appear in local records, scholarships, small foundations established in quiet remembrance. These gestures were not attempts to keep the pain alive, but to give it purpose. The family understood that remembrance could not undo loss, but it could prevent erasure. In honoring the victim, they reclaimed agency over a narrative that had once stripped it away. Media interest flared occasionally, usually triggered by anniversaries or advances in forensic science. Each resurgence brought a familiar cycle: headlines, interviews, speculation, then retreat. The story was retold so many times that it risked becoming simplified, its complexity flattened into a single, shocking revelation. Those closest to it resisted that reduction. They knew the truth had been messier, slower, filled with years that did not fit neatly into a script. The convicted neighbor's life behind bars receded from public view. There were no dramatic confessions, no final monologues offering clarity. Silence filled the gaps where explanations might have been. Psychologists debated motives in abstract terms, but the individual reality remained opaque. Not every story yields insight proportional to its impact. What endured instead was the lesson about proximity. Evil, the case suggested, does not always announce itself through extremes. Sometimes it thrives in normalcy, in routines that attract no attention. The revelation did not turn the town inward or suspicious. It encouraged vigilance without paranoia, awareness without accusation. Students studying criminal justice cited the case in papers about delayed resolution. They analyzed timelines, evidentiary thresholds, the ethics of reopening wounds long thought closed. The case became a reference point for discussions about whether closure is ever complete or merely sufficient. The consensus leaned toward the latter. Even technology carried the imprint of the story. Databases expanded. Laws changed. Protocols evolved to ensure that evidence would be retained longer, analyzed more thoroughly. The case had nudged the system forward, not through outrage, but through proof. It demonstrated that time, when paired with preservation, could be an ally rather than an enemy. At night, long after public interest had waned, the streets where everything had once converged remained quiet. No markers indicated their significance. Cars passed. Lights flickered on and off. The world moved forward, indifferent to the layers of meaning beneath its surface. Only those who knew felt the weight of history embedded in ordinary places. The phrase, "justice delayed is justice denied," echoed differently now. The case complicated it. Justice had arrived late, undeniably so, yet it had arrived with enough force to matter. The delay had caused harm. Years of uncertainty, suspicion, pain, but the resolution had also prevented the finality of forgetting. It forced a reckoning with the idea that imperfect justice is still justice, though it comes at a cost. In interviews years later, when asked what should be remembered, investigators avoided dramatic language. They spoke about persistence. about respecting the process even when it offers nothing in return for years, about believing that truth does not expire. Their voices carried no triumph, only conviction. The community, too, learned to live with the story without letting it define them. It became one thread in a larger tapestry, no longer the center. People married, children grew up, businesses opened and closed. Life, relentless and ordinary, reclaimed its territory. Yet the cold case never truly vanished. It hovered at the edge of awareness, a reminder that certainty is fragile and time is deceptive. It asked those who remembered it to look twice, to question easy answers, to accept that some truths arrive only when patience outlasts doubt. As the years continued to stretch forward, the story settled into a quieter form of endurance. Not a warning shouted into the dark, but a steady presence, urging attention, care, and humility. It remained proof that the past is never as distant as it seems, and that even when answers finally come, they leave behind questions that refuse to fade. The case had been solved, but its work was not finished. It continued to shape how justice was pursued, how trust was given, how silence was interpreted. In that way, it lived on, not as a headline, but as an influence, subtle and persistent, woven into the collective understanding of what it means to wait for the truth and what it costs when the truth takes its time. Time is not in a story like this. It only changes the way it breathes. By the time the case had existed longer in resolution than it ever had in mystery, it no longer demanded attention. It lingered instead, woven into habits, into cautionary instincts, into the quiet pauses people took before trusting what seemed obvious. The cold case had been solved, yes, but its presence had become something more diffuse, less visible, and far more enduring. What remained was a subtle unease with certainty. The community had learned, slowly and without ceremony, that answers are not always absent because they are hidden, but because they are waiting for the right moment to be understood. That lesson reshaped conversations in ways no verdict ever could. People listened longer. They asked follow-up questions. They learned the value of silence, not as avoidance, but as space where truth might eventually surface. The final years of public discussion drifted away from the crime itself and toward its consequences. Scholars, journalists, and advocates no longer focused on the night it happened, but on the decades that followed. On how lives are shaped not just by violence, but by uncertainty. On how waiting alters perception, hardens some people, softens others, and leaves most suspended somewhere in between. The victim's story, once defined by absence, began to be told with greater care. Not as a symbol, not as a statistic, but as a person whose life had been interrupted and then stretched across time through memory. Those who spoke about the victim now emphasized who they were before the crime, resisting the instinct to let the ending eclipse everything else. It was a quiet reclamation, an insistence that a life is more than the way it ends. For the family, closure had never been a destination. It was a process, uneven and incomplete. The arrest had answered the central question, but it had not restored what was lost. Instead, it offered a different burden, the task of integrating truth into a grief that had already built its own structure. They learned that resolution does not erase pain. It reorganizes it. The accused, now permanently defined by the crime, faded almost entirely from public consciousness. There were no revelations left to uncover, no mysteries to solve. What remained was a record, fixed and unmoving. The absence of spectacle in the final chapter felt appropriate. Some stories do not end with clarity or explanation. They end with silence. In law enforcement, the case gradually stopped being cited as an example and started being treated as a standard. Evidence retention policies changed. Interagency cooperation improved. DNA databases expanded not because of pressure, but because of precedent. The lesson had been absorbed. The system, imperfect and human, had adjusted its posture slightly toward patience. Younger investigators, who had never known a world without advanced forensic tools, studied the case with a kind of historical curiosity. To them, the delay felt almost inconceivable. But their mentors reminded them that every era believes it has reached the limits of possibility, only to be proven wrong later. The case became a warning against complacency, against assuming that today's answers are final. Outside institutions, the story lived most powerfully in private moments, in the way parents checked in more often, in the way neighbors noticed when routines changed, in the way people learned to hold suspicion and empathy at the same time without letting either dominate. The case did not make the town fearful. It made it attentive. The physical spaces tied to the story continued to evolve, absorbing new lives and new meanings. The crime scene bore no trace of its history. The streets no longer whispered. Yet for those who knew, there was a quiet acknowledgement when passing through, a recognition that some places carry layers invisible to the eye. Memory, like evidence, does not require visibility to endure. In the broader culture, the fascination with cold cases only grew. New stories emerged. New mysteries demanded attention. Yet this case remained distinct, not because of its brutality, but because of its patience. It had waited without demanding belief, without insisting on relevance. When the answer finally arrived, it did so without spectacle, reshaping the narrative not through drama, but through inevitability. The phrase DNA twist had once dominated headlines, but over time it felt insufficient. The real twist was not technological. It was psychological. The revelation that familiarity can coexist with deception, that proximity does not guarantee understanding. That realization did not fade. It settled into the background, influencing how people interpreted the world around them. Years later, when asked what the case ultimately meant, those closest to it struggled to answer. Meaning felt too deliberate, too clean. The story resisted being distilled into a moral or a warning. It was not about good and evil in their simplest forms. It was about complexity, about the limits of perception, about the long arc of truth bending slowly, sometimes painfully, toward visibility. The cold case had become a reminder that justice is not a single moment, but a sequence of decisions, many of them unremarkable, made by people who often do not know the importance of what they are doing. A technician sealing evidence, a detective documenting a detail, a policymaker choosing preservation over convenience. These were the real turning points, invisible until they weren't. As the final witnesses aged and memories dimmed, the story transitioned fully from lived experience to historical record. It entered archives, databases, footnotes. But unlike most records, it retained a pulse. It continued to influence how questions were asked, how silence was interpreted, how time was valued. In quiet reflections, some acknowledged a truth that felt uncomfortable but necessary. If the case had never been solved, the world would have kept moving anyway. Life would have continued. The absence of resolution would not have stopped time. That realization gave the answer, when it finally came, a different weight. It was not inevitable. It was earned. The story did not end with satisfaction. It ended with understanding. A recognition that truth does not arrive to fix everything, but to reframe what has already happened. That reframing, subtle and persistent, was the case's final contribution. The California night that began it all receded further into the past, no longer sharp, no longer immediate, but was never erased. It existed as a point of origin, a reminder of how easily the ordinary can fracture and how long it can take to see the fracture clearly. In the end, the cold case did what few stories manage. It outgrew its own conclusion. It became less about what happened and more about what followed. About patience, about humility, about the quiet discipline of waiting for the truth without demanding it arrive on our terms. And so the story rests now, not resolved into silence, but into awareness. A presence rather than a headline. A lesson rather than a spectacle. Proof that some truths, once uncovered, do not close a chapter. They open a way of seeing that never quite goes away. The case was solved, but its echo remains steady and unresolved in a different way, reminding anyone willing to listen that time does not bury the truth. It only asks whether we are prepared to recognize it when it finally emerges. The story does not conclude when the microphones are turned off or when the files are sealed for the last time. It continues in the spaces where memory settles, where meaning keeps rearranging itself long after facts have stopped changing. By the time this case reached what anyone might reasonably call its end, it had already moved beyond ownership. It no longer belonged to investigators or journalists, or even to the system that finally named the truth. It belonged to time. Time had been the silent partner from the beginning. It was there on the night everything fractured, stretching seconds